We are here today at another episode of The Intersection, at the intersection of technology and culture, art and business, however you want to describe it. Today, I'm here with Sonia Nagar. She's a venture capitalist at the Pritzker Group, where, like all of the best VCs I know, she has been a founder herself. She has a background in mechanical engineering, and she's a self-taught programmer where her first job out of college was at General Motors in the advanced engineering group. She went to Harvard for her MBA and worked at Amazon as a product manager. Wow, what a track record. And, and afterwards, it's pronounced Picky, right?
Picky, yep.
At Picky, like a personalization mobile shopping tool that
Yep.
helped you, like a catalog for your iPad.
Yeah, it was like a shoppable magazine. It's a good way to think about it. Back in 2011, 12, when the iPad App Store was brand new.
There you go. And I met Sonia thanks to Claude's Fireside Chat. Shout out to Claude. Like a cool, warm introduction. Thank you
Well,
for joining me here
thank you for
today.
having me here today. I'm excited to be here.
I appreciate Sonia. And so one thing you talk about a lot is founder VC fit.
Mm-hmm.
That obviously beyond the transaction, there should be an alignment between the humans that are
Yeah.
doing the deal.
No, I mean, I definitely, when I'm advising first-time founders or just really early-stage founders on how to go about fundraising, I talk a lot about making sure that you are thoughtful about who you pick to allow in as an investor. I think a lot of time people think, oh, I'm going to go and fundraise, and it's all about just getting the money and you just got to hit a dollar amount. But the reality is once you take somebody's money in as an investor, and especially if you take somebody's money in and they're your lead investor and they're taking a board seat, it's kind of like a marriage with no divorce because you can't get them off your cap table or out of your life without like a pretty messy process. And sometimes it's impossible. So I advise people to spend time getting to know investors before they go out and fundraise. I think that helps them not only evaluate who they're a good fit with and who they think can add the most value to them as they're building, but it also helps the investor get to know the founder as well.
Speaking of founder VC fit, you've said startups often optimize for valuation instead of the right partners. You want to talk a little bit?
Sometimes people do. I think now there's been a lot more published by founders about their experiences where enough founders, I think, have been open about what it looks like if you go for the highest valuation and not for the best partner who can add value and build your business. And so I think I'm seeing that less where there's always some level of balance. Like you don't want to take a term sheet and have an investor own 50% of your company or 30% of your company. You know, like there's some...
Because they were the right fit.
Right.
Yeah.
There's some valuations that just may not. But I would argue that the right investor is going to give you a valuation you can feel good about, that they also feel good about. And that's the best way to start a partnership. And it's also the best way to set yourself up for the next round. Sometimes, and what we're seeing from companies that raised in 2021 when everything was frothy and they raised at really high valuations and maybe they didn't have the numbers to justify the valuation they got, but the idea was, oh, we'll give you a bunch of cash and maybe you can grow into it. Now I think you're reading about founders who are shutting down, and if they'd raised at a different valuation, maybe they would have been able to raise that next round of funding at a flat valuation or even a slightly up, slight up valuation. But I think once you've raised a certain level of valuation, the expectations are different and higher for what your business metrics need to be in order to get the next round done.
Have you seen that play out in ways where the expectations get mismatched with the founders or the VCs? And what do you have any best advice so that people up front, when they make the deal, it doesn't get complicated later?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is always good going into a deal. We try to be very clear. And Pritzker Group, we're a little bit unique in that we're a slightly larger fund and we have a concentrated portfolio strategy. So anytime we invest, we want to write more checks behind that company and pretty big checks behind that company over the life of that company. And so we always go in and say, okay, for us to write that bigger check in that next round or to, here's what the milestones are that we need to see you hit in 12 to 18 months. And then it's very clear, here are the expectations going in. And then it's just lots of communication and feedback. And I'll be honest, often, very rarely, does a company exactly hit the metrics they need to hit. But I think it's also important to have the conversation with your investors up front and understand before you decide to partner with an investor, how do they handle those tough times? Because often, like it's pretty common, you're going to need an extension or a little bit more time to hit your metrics or to figure things out. And you want to know that your investors have a history or a strategy of like when they decide they want to invest behind you, they're going to support you in the good times and the bad times. And in the bad times, that may mean writing a supportive check to give you more time, even if you haven't hit all your numbers. So it's like what happens in the best case scenario, you're getting a higher valuation and more money. In the worst case situation, you want to know that your investors are still going to support you to give you a little bit more time to figure things out. So more money, even if the valuation might be flat.
What? That's so interesting. What? Not to assume anything, but have you seen scenarios where founders are in hot water and they essentially kind of, I can't think of a better, lie because they...
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely bad actors, I think, in any environment, in any industry. And obviously there's some high profile cases of folks that have gotten in hot water with the law because, you know, they've been bad actors. But you don't typically see it. And I think as an investor, it is imperative, and especially as a board member, you have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that you're kind of double checking the work. So you're being provided generally with monthly financials so you can kind of understand the reality of a business. And with our founders, we're generally talking monthly about KPIs, key performance indicators as well. So we have a pretty good pulse on where things are going. It would be really hard for somebody to be dishonest. We also try to have multiple touch points with the company. So it's, yes, the CEO is usually our primary contact, but we try to get to know the entire executive team. So we've got multiple channels for information to flow. So if anybody suspects that something funny is going on, you know, we have
you
lots
have a
of
single
challenges.
person that could potentially be whatever was going on with them emotionally. You have other people to...
Yeah, but I think we can be most helpful when we know the entire executive team to figure out, like, how do we connect them with the right mentors or the right companies that have just done what they did that are just a step ahead of them so that they can learn faster. And it's never a single founder. You know, often you're investing behind a founder or founding team, but the whole team is what will ultimately decide whether the company is successful. It's like for a startup to go right, you need a lot of things to go right. You need the product and technology to work.
Very
you need
true.
the sales function to work. You need the financials to like have good reporting and analytics so you're making the right decisions. HR, you need hiring and culture to work. And so we really do try to be pretty hands-on to avoid, you know, just to make sure the information is flowing. And that's on us.
You'd say how many VC firms would you say are that hands-on? Because I think there's a certain sentiment with VCs that they say in a maybe virtuous way, we're more hands-on than the other VCs. Or maybe that's just the VCs I know, and there's a lot of VCs that aren't hands-on. What is the hands-on dynamic with VCs? And
yeah, I always think it's interesting. Now I've been on a bunch of boards, and so I've seen, at least in the boardroom, a lot of people say they're hands-on, and then when you talk to founders or you see what they're actually doing, you know, if they're showing up unprepared for board meeting, I've been surprised at how many people are not actually hands-on. And I think the best way for a founder to vet that is by talking to other founders that investor or firm has invested in and figuring out what value did they actually add. You know, they said they had this great network. Did they make any introductions? They said they could help with all of these things. When I asked them for help, or when they've been asked for help, have they helped? So there are practical ways. It's just like when we're going into an investment, we're often doing reference checks. Founders should do the same thing on their investors.
Right. I feel like you have a really intelligent perspective on both ends of the reference checks, that you understand that for founders, they should reference other founders who've worked with partners that have invested into or could potentially invest into them. And on the VC side, you want to check anybody who's worked with this founder in the past to know if they're the right person to invest in. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I don't feel like a lot of VCs do that, or they
should. I mean, if you're saying that people, if you think about hiring, if you're going to hire somebody, would you hire somebody without doing reference checks or background checks?
Right.
You never would if you were in an operating role. There's no reason. It's like the people are so critical in a startup. And so why wouldn't you do that there? And then vice versa. I think a lot of people know that it's the right thing to do, but it takes work. And so you gotta, not everybody wants to put in the work.
True. Earlier, you mentioned KPIs, and maybe this is an ignorant opinion, but I've always felt like KPIs lacked some kind of substance. That if you're really focused on a specific metric, that there are other factors within the process of trying to make something happen that are not as easy to measure. Maybe this isn't being articulated very well, but how do you balance KPIs with like the more qualitative aspects
Yeah.
of founding something?
Yeah. So I think the key thing is to pick the right KPIs, and have a short list of true north there, things that you're tracking, and you got to track inputs. So things like your cash position or your revenue, those are outputs. Those are not inputs. Inputs would be how many sales leads is your sales team bringing in per month, or how many, if you're in a marketplace business, how much new supply have you brought online in the last month? And so it's a little bit step ahead of revenue and some of the outputs. And I think the art is when you work with an experienced investor who's seen a bunch of businesses in your space, they know what the right things are to track. And they'll help
Right.
guide you on here are 3 or 4 really important things that you need to be tracking. There's a lot of noise and you can get distracted trying to chase this metric or that metric, but here's what matters. And then the revenue will follow. So that's again, I
That
think
was a good answer.
Yeah, if you either you can get that advice from other founders that are in your category on what they've tracked, or you can talk to investors who've done a bunch of deals in your space. And even if they, maybe you pitch them for investment and they pass, you could ask them, I know you invested in such and such company that's very similar to mine. What metrics do they track at the board level?
To make a little tangent, at Picky, you were very involved in this consumer-focused personalization tool. So is there anything these days that in terms of personalization when it comes to consumers or brands that are becoming more personalized, that
Yeah.
trends or stuff that you're looking at?
Yeah, right now personalization has really become table stakes. It's like consumers expect to get an email that is relevant to them. Otherwise, they're just going to delete it. And same, text message, the bar is even higher. It's got to be timely and relevant. Otherwise, people are going to unsubscribe. And so the bar is really high, I think, for consumer expectations. So in 2011, what we were doing to try to make a more curated, personalized experience, I think now it's table stakes for consumer brands. If you're trying
That's what I was
to
thinking.
appeal and win over customers, you've got to stand for something very specific. And so I've definitely seen a proliferation of brands. It's if you are in clothing and apparel, it's there are very small, distinct brands that can speak to any aesthetic, any body type, any,
Right.
affinity group you may be affiliated with. And so that's been interesting to me, see the hyper fragmentation in consumer, because it makes me wonder, what's the potential to build a mega brand if people expect such personalization, customization, authenticity. It's one reason why we do less consumer products investing today at a Pritzker Group than we did 5-10 years ago. We were early in Dollar Shave Club, on Honest Company, and Casper.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I think at that point in time, direct to consumer was new. And it was really hard. It was harder to start.
How long ago was that?
10 years. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Really?
8 years. Yeah. So, but times have changed and it's become so easy to build a brand that now everybody can build a brand and anyone can build a brand. And so that's
true.
allowed for this super hyper fragmentation where people can find products that are very specific to their identity and who they are and the causes they want to support. It just makes it harder to get everybody on board because it's marketing has to be so specific.
Where do you think that's going? What kind of thing could you invest in that would be?
That would get me back into the No, I think the strategy that a couple that I've been pitched a couple of times have not made a bet on yet is that you can build a next generation Procter and Gamble or a L'Oreal, a collection of brands. I just haven't seen that yet. There's one company that did a really interesting pitch that has a couple really successful consumer products that I think has a shot at it. but they're too later stage for us because we come in usually Series A. They're well beyond us.
Interesting. Well, this has my mind running. Like, everything's so specific and so niche. But like you said, is there a scenario where you can be Procter and Gamble, but for a million niches?
Yeah.
You're like,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think people are definitely trying. And for a while, there was a lot of money that got poured into Amazon roll-up plays where people were buying a bunch of Amazon brands and and you saw that strategy in a couple of other places as well. But I haven't, I don't know what brand today I would pick. I know what brand I would pick to potentially be that next gen platform. It's going to be a long time before that gets proven out.
speaking of long time, one thing you've talked about is the very long-term cycle of VC that you have hundreds and hundreds of companies that you talk to and that pitch you, and you only invest in a handful, and then to see that result, it takes 10 years.
Yeah.
So what is that experience like, waiting 10 years to see the result of your initial bet?
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely the biggest change or adjustment for me when I switched from being an operator to being an investor. When you're an operator, you can measure your success every week. You have your metrics, your KPIs you're tracking. And so every week I could say, we got the right number of downloads for the mobile app, or we had this much revenue come through, and you get a lot of affirmation. I think in venture capital, you just have to have more conviction sometimes that the bets that you're making are the right bets. And sometimes they will, you'll get external validation and that they get marked up or they get acquired, but that can take years. So, but it's a lot of fun because you get to be diversified. You get to see a bunch of different companies doing different things and you get to learn. And I think people are shortcuts, and founders are some of the most passionate, interesting people. And so having them take you along with them on their, teach you about a category, take you along with them on the journey. There'll be some things you bring to the table, a lot you learn from them. It's fascinating.
What's particularly fascinating to you about the journey of being with a founder over time? Because I'm sure sometimes it can feel personal, no?
Oh, it definitely does. I think venture capital is a little bit funny in that, you kind of work all the time because you don't know where your next deal is going to come from. So it's like I'm sitting with you here today doing this podcast. Maybe somebody is going to listen to it that happens to be a founder. And a year from now, they reach out to me and they say, hey, I heard you on this podcast and I want to figure out if we have founder VC fit.
Right.
And so let's hang out. And maybe that company goes on to be Facebook. You don't know. And you have all these crazy stories of serendipity doing its thing in venture capital. And so, I'd say I spend a third of my time doing top of funnel activities. That's kind of meeting with founders, helping founders out. And you've got to believe in the power of community and that doing good is you pay it forward and it'll come back to you in some way, shape, or form. And you don't necessarily know how. And so but it's a beautiful thing. It's like I am now 7 years in. There are founders that I worked with 5 or 6 years ago that are now on their second company coming back. Or there's definitely examples of founders where I was on the board and we brought them into other Pritzker portfolio companies to help out. And so you seeing that long arc of getting to work with great people and finding different ways to bring your favorite people back into your orbit is a beautiful thing.
It's so interesting. It's a lot to take in. It's like you said, you spend a third of your time basically doing things that may or may not have a return.
Yeah.
But just out of what you find is enthusiastic to you and interesting to you and
meeting people taking first. I consider you take a first meeting with a founder who's super early. Maybe, we invest at Series A. So we're not the family and friends round and we're not that first seed round either. We're the next round. And so sometimes people will come and ask to meet with me and they've just got an idea. And it's like, it could be 3 years before I'm going to be the right investor. But if it's a founder who is building something in a category that I'm interested in and they've done their research and they're like, I know you've invested in these companies and this is why I think you'll be interested in what I'm doing, I'll take those meetings. Not all of them, but I take a handful of those meetings. But again, that's like a top of funnel activity where it could be years before that plays out and that founder remembers that I helped them in some way, shape, or form. But
Cool. This is so cool.
Yeah.
One thing I was really curious to ask you about that I heard in a separate podcast was how you guys essentially, you do, but essentially you don't have any LPs.
Yes.
That Tony and JB fund pretty much all of your efforts. And so what is it like having a responsibility to work smart and collaboratively with Tony and JB versus having a responsibility to a bunch of LPs where
Yeah.
I've never been in that position with those relationships
Yeah.
are.
Well, I actually think it's really similar. So JB is governor of Illinois, so he's not in the day-to-day at all. He's doing that. And then Tony spends a lot of time with our private equity team, but we have pretty regular, chats with him. And so it's kind of the same responsibility where ultimately we're measured on our ability to make money and to build a great portfolio. And I think the nice thing is Pritzker Group is a fund that's been around for 30 years. It's probably one of the oldest funds here in Chicago, and the track record is strong. And so there's a lot of trust that gets built when you've demonstrated that you can make good decisions and good financial decisions and also, good investment decisions. So
Makes sense.
build trust over time. Yeah, the same way you do with LPs and
You're right.
in a
It makes sense
traditional
with any
fund,
LP.
you're asking them to come in and invest, and then they're going to evaluate you every, periodically to say, do they want to re-up? And so you have to build the same kind of trust and
Right.
relationship.
Right. You've said Chicago, unlike New York or San Francisco and a lot of other places, has a unique advantage in its VC ecosystem where it's easier to get to people.
Yeah, I think so. I think Chicago is still small compared to San Francisco for sure and New York for sure. And so if you want to, if you wanted to talk to me, you came up to me at a fireside chat.
Claude's
You can figure out a
fireside.
way to meet with people because there's a lot of, I think people realize that we're still working to build up the ecosystem. And in order for Chicago to thrive and for us as investors to thrive and to attract talent to come here, we all still need to work together. And the folks that are further along in the journey need to give back to the folks that are just getting started. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And I think the nice thing about venture capital and technology ecosystems in general is that founders literally come from nothing and then become something. And I think founders remember how hard it is. And even if you're a second, third time founder, I've heard successful founders that have had billion-dollar exits on their second company tell me that it's been just as hard to fundraise and just as hard to build because
Really?
Startups are hard. I think some things become easier, like maybe raising your first round of funding is easier, but that second and third round can still be hard. And maybe hiring becomes a little bit easier because you have your first 10 hires, but then as you scale, you've still got to figure out all the things around culture and HR and people management and processes all over again. So, I think because of that, people bond more deeply. And I do think people want to pay it forward because they remember how hard it is. And they recognize that ecosystems thrive, like all ships rise together. And so we need to make sure we have a high tide rising all boats by helping. And so, I don't know. I think in some of the more successful, larger ecosystems, there can be a little bit more probably snobbery or elitism where people expect you to be able to find a warm introduction, to be introduced by a certain person. Otherwise, they're not going to take the meeting. I think people in Chicago are generally more open, and they're definitely more collaborative too. I think because we have a lot more smaller funds, people are more likely to syndicate a deal, which just means that they're on the coast because the funds are so large. They need, if it's a $10 million round, that investor is going to take $10 million because they need the whole round because they've got to deploy as much capital as they can in order to make their fund economics work. Whereas in Chicago, you've got smaller funds. People are more likely to phone a friend and say, hey, I'm doing this deal. There's some room. Do you want to co-lead it with me or be part of it?
So would you say conclusively that because Chicago's smaller in what's going on, there's more potential for us to rise the tide together? So maybe we're at a unique opportunity where there's like a lot of collaborative recycling that can go on within the
Yeah,
next
I mean,
couple
I'm an
decades?
optimist, so that's definitely the optimistic way to look at things. I think, the pessimistic way to look at things would be say we're small, we don't have big funds here, and so it's harder for startups to get funded. We haven't had, a mega exit like Facebook or Google, and so we don't have that kind of recycling of talent or the big pull to bring talent in, to train the talent, and then to like recycle the talent back into our ecosystem with experience of what it looks like to operate at a world-class tech company. And so I think there are pros and cons. I'm an optimist. I'm going to
But
take
the
the
optimist in
former.
you
The
says we
optimist
can do
says
that in the next
we
5,
could,
10
well, I
years.
think it's going to take a long time. I mean, I think what we really need are those mega exits. Like we need some mega companies, mega success stories to be those like anchor tenants the same way that you have Microsoft and Amazon in Seattle. And then really it's like the Bay Area has done it best with so much density of the companies, the talent, the capital. That kind of creates the trifecta for helping startups succeed.
So would you agree, even though we live in such a remote international world at this point, that there's still a lot of importance in having a local
Yes.
density?
Yes. I mean, I do think at the earliest stages for angel investors who are writing that very first check and for seed investors, often people prefer to invest locally. In the Bay Area, the analogy, the thing that I've heard or the saying that I've heard is that some investors only want to invest a bike ride distance
I've heard
radius
that same thing.
from where they live. And while it sounds trite and kind of like, well, why would you restrict
Kinda
yourself
makes
that way?
sense.
It does make sense because if you think about it, and even for for Pritzker Group, we invest nationally. A third of our portfolio is Midwest. In the Midwest, we do have deep relationships with the founders. So if you're looking to hire your first CMO, CFO, we know the service provider. Like we're able to help uniquely in some ways in the areas where we have some density. So we definitely, New York is another ecosystem we've invested a bunch in, and then LA. And so those are kind of the three geographies, like East, Northeast,
Mid, and West Coast.
we kind of have some good coverage, but it helps. It helps to, and then you can do more in-person things. You can break bread, have drinks. So there's a deeper level of relationship building that you can do in person. And I know folks hate to go into the office now, apparently, but
I don't think so.
I
don't
like
think
in
so.
person. Obviously, we met in an in-person fireside chat.
Right.
If you had sent me a cold email, I think it'd be much
Probably
harder
not
for me.
would know.
Probably would not have
Much,
signed
much
up.
harder,
But
I'd
you
say.
came up to me in person, and I was like, "Oh, okay, it seems like a reasonable ask." And you took all the the time to get out to that fireside chat. I appreciate that it's a little bit harder, and because it's harder,
It's a
people
genuine
appreciate the
thing.
effort.
I told Claude has facilitated a lot of people I've brought on this podcast, honestly, even if they were remote. Like, have you Nate Jones? He's like a former partner in Andreessen Horowitz for 8 years. And I met him at the Tech Chicago week, and all type of people I've had on the podcast.
Yeah.
So you're right. There, even if it's remote or in person, there's so much value in actually meeting someone
Yes.
where both of them have put in a certain amount of access to get into the same space.
A little bit of effort goes a long way.
One thing during the fireside, speaking of the fireside, is you said if you weren't in business in the way that you are, that you'd open up a coffee shop.
Yeah.
And not to throw the audience under the bus, but it felt like some of the people were little bit thrown off by this response, that they were like, a coffee shop.
Yeah, I know. People don't understand. I mean, I think the comment I'm making is more, I think everybody thinks the grass is greener on the other side. And I probably fall into that bucket where I'm like, I've built software companies and now I invest in software and technology companies. But there's something appealing about like a brick and mortar, a business, So, and I love coffee and tea. You got to do what you love. So I've always thought that would be like a fun retirement gig. I'm far from that, but
Do you feel like people in the broader world of business and entrepreneurship could be a little bit more open-minded to the nature of what fulfillment is? Like, in the sense that you were like, I could open up a coffee shop. And they were like, a coffee shop?
Yeah.
I don't think you can be successful in a coffee shop.
Yeah, I mean,
But,
somebody
like,
started Pete's Coffee. Somebody founded Starbucks. Like, don't get me wrong. I mean, you can build an empire doing many things. And I think that's one thing I've come to appreciate being in Chicago, where not everybody has become successful in tech, some people have made a lot of money doing other traditional things. And so I think in the tech bubble, if you only talk to founders and tech people, it can give you a warped view of the world and how to be happy. And so I like having outside perspectives and try to spend a reasonable amount of time getting exposure to folks who are not in the tech echo chamber, because I think it's healthy. And ultimately, because I do a fair amount of consumer investing, it's important to understand what real people are doing. And like the people in urban city centers and in these tech echo chambers are not normal people. So it's like, for me to have a pulse on what is going to work in a business, I need to not
outside
always,
of that.
Yes. I need to have a diverse set of perspectives. And I think often I'll get pulled in there by the founders that I talk with. If somebody's starting a company and they are selling in the construction equipment industry or ag equipment industry, I'm talking to farmers. And, I try to, we do a lot of customer interviews to gain a perspective, which is one of the things I love about my job, because you get to be a little bit of like a cultural anthropologist and just understand how other people view the world and what's important to them and how they think about whether it's buying decisions. Like, I find it fascinating.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. But I'm literally making a private agency around what you just described just now, because I feel like teams are not very good at that. I happen to be really, really good at that.
Yeah.
Anyway, you're right. One thing you've talked about before is when I listened to you during the fireside chat, you seem to have a unique kind of mindset on your family. Maybe not unique, but you spoke about it in a way that was endearing to me. So like, how does Sonia feel about being a mom and a family member?
Yeah. I mean, I love it. I have 3 kids, 6, 4, and 2, and a little dog. We live in the city. And I mean, it's just so much fun. I think you learn a lot from seeing your kids learn. And so that's fascinating to me. Like, it's talking about cultural anthropology and just understanding
seeing the
why
kids
people think and why they do certain things. And like, these are the consumers of the future. And I get to experience different things through them too. Like, they go through school and activities or reading books, like rereading books that I read as a kid. It's totally fun. It's very rewarding. And I think it makes me better at my job.
I agree 2,000%. I'm sure it makes you better at your job because you have no choice but to be an anthropologist.
Yeah. You got to understand why people do what they do and try to help them be good humans. And so you got to love people. And I like people. I think that's probably I think there's a bunch of different ways to be good in venture capital, but there's no doubt that you do have to build relationships with people, the founders you invest in, other investors you want to invest with, and I like people, so it's a good fit. I'm very happy in where I've landed.
That's a good takeaway before we close this off. I wish, or I hope, that investors like people because that's what they're investing in.
Yeah. You hope, yes.
Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast today, Sonia. And if there's anything else you'd like to plug, anything related to your work, other people that you're enthusiastic about around the city, or anything in the world that you want to give a voice to right now, you have the floor to do that. Otherwise,
well, I mean, I don't know if I have any asks but I'll just say, if you're a founder and if I can be helpful, don't be shy about pinging me. We invest in Series A startups, marketplaces, and vertical SaaS. So if you're in that category, let me know.
What about to the more creative and artist-like people who are watching this, who may see VC as something a little bit alien or foreign to them? What type of things, words of wisdom do you feel I could say that we're all a little bit more closer than we assume?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think as an artist, you're making bets and trying to understand where culture is going and kind of trying to, and I'm not saying, I know some artists might poo-poo the external validation, but if you're trying to make a life,
they want to know that they are the one who knows what's next up.
Yeah, you want to know what's next. And so that's a very similar concept as what we do in venture capital. We just we're less gut and a little bit more data. As you get later stage, you're looking at a lot more data. But at the earliest stages, like the pre-seed and seed investors, that's a lot more gut and people and understanding. And so, we're not as far as you may think.
Absolutely. I actually try to give this example to people all the time, that there is a social capital that people get out of knowing that so and so was the next person to be famous,
Yeah.
or to there. That's a very real thing.
Mm-hmm.
So people have no idea what VC is, but when I tell them that VC is the equivalent to that,
Yeah.
they suddenly understand it.
Trying to pick which artist is going to be
Right, next.
Next.
It's the same thing.
Same thing.
Well, thank you so much, Sonia. I really appreciate it. And yeah, this was awesome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.